All right. Hello and welcome. Thank you for tuning in to the Dank Christian Memes podcast. My name is Broclen. I'm one of the moderators along with Jacob here. I'm also the digital minister for the community. Today we're talking about purity culture, but before we dive into that, I want to talk a little bit about our fundraiser for St. Jude. Now we work with a group of subs, and I'm not giving you a number because it's been hard to keep track of lately. Our alliance has grown. We've had some subs, big and small and medium, joining us, so that's been really good. Our fundraiser we do every Lent. We raise funds for St. Jude. Obviously, we at Dank Christian Memes think of it as Lent. The other subs just think of it as a nice time to do a fundraiser. So we fundraise until around Easter. And currently we're getting pretty close to our second stretch goal, which is $5,000. So that's pretty good. We've only been going about a week, so we had some good momentum there. On this podcast, we're going to be talking a little bit more about our fundraiser as we go, and we may have some of our partners on to do sort of a collaboration episode and learn about our partners and what their subs are like. Am I missing anything, Jacob? Is my spiel? Am I lacking any details in my explanation here?
It sounds pretty good. If people are wondering more things, they can always come to the Discord server where we'll take questions directly. Or, you can always comment on the relevant posts to it on the subreddit, and there'll be answers there as well. Just let us know. And our fundraiser link is literally everywhere. In the comments below, in our posts, on our sidebar. So if you're looking to donate, our fundraiser link will find you. So, all right. So before we dive into the topic of hand, purity culture, which I'm really excited for, right? Because we talked about masculinity, and that definitely bumps into purity culture. And last time we talked about deconstruction. And I think that those are sort of related concepts already. So why don't we all talk about where we exist in the world of faith, or maybe not in the world of faith, and then we'll go dive into our definition of purity culture and really tear it apart and see if we agree with it or not. So Jacob, why don't you get us started? So I guess in relation to purity culture, I guess I will clarify, because this is going to color my entire discussion of everything, that I have a history and a master's degree in archaeology of the ancient Near East, and therefore my current perception of biblical purity discussion is going to be very colored by ancient Near Eastern context to it. I have a history in purity culture in that I grew up in a fairly protected church environment, but I wouldn't say it's ever been a concept that existed on my mind consciously for most of my existence until faith deconstruction, as we talked about before, because it tends to be one of those things that, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more later, that kind of exists subconsciously most of the time for most people. And so that's how it's been for me. And I think I'm a lot less beholden to it, but at the same time, more critical of my place relative to purity at this point in my life.
I'll say that from my experience, I grew up in the United Church of Christ, and I never really felt like purity culture was a big part of what my church was pushing. But I did get the impression that it would be more chill in Jesus's eyes if I waited till marriage to have sex. And I'm not really sure how that slipped into my mind, because like I said, I don't think my church was pushing it. So maybe it was something, in the water, so to speak, in the culture of my area. Castor Troy, what's your position on all this? Are you sort of an outsider purity culture, or does it leak? Is it visible for those who didn't have a super religious upbringing?
Oh, it's absolutely super visible, even from the outside. Even when I texted you yesterday when we were kind of planning this all out, the outsider perspective that I grew up with is always, oh, won't someone please think of the children? And it's usually based around like anything that's remotely sexual or deemed quote unquote satanic, even like, and it really could be the color red. So I grew up in a Baptist family. A lot of my family is from the South, but I'm from New England. So it's just so it was a lot of purity culture kind of go through the lens of respectability politics, as well as kind of a don't be sexual kind of thing that's largely it. And everything kind of branches out from there, and they kind of figure out their talking points along those lines. So that's mostly my perspective, at least from that upbringing.
I like that term, respectability politics. I feel like let's hold on to that one. I think it's gonna come up more than once. Void Boy and then Olive, what's your sort of experience / exposure to purity culture?
It's weird because it wouldn't be like I grew up like Jehovah's Witness for like most of my life. So it's like a lot of the things that might seem as purity culture might look deranged for anyone else, even amongst Christians. So it's be pretty hard to like say that I've grappled purity culture within the same realm as like Western Christians, or like you would say like how purity culture usually looks like in regular kind of Christian environments, whether it be Baptist or like Catholics or whatever. Would you say that
Jehovah's Witnesses sort of have their own brand of purity culture?
They have their own brand of purity culture that would probably be similar to like a Looney Tunes episode out there. And sometimes it's hard to there's some things I can go in detail into like some of the stuff that they talk in detail that could be that's seen as purity culture, but it's not like the word doesn't exist amongst like the group. So it's kind of hard for me to kind of say point and say, oh, that's purity culture. And then, or is that purity culture, or is this like wackiness of a cult? So that is I might be limited in my ability to talk about purity culture in this sense.
Well, and you raise a good point that, we're calling it purity culture, but, those who abide by, such a code, just think of it as, the right thing to do.
Yeah. And I was in it for like about 14 years. And after I left, which is funny because after I left the group, then I was exposed to purity culture in online spaces. And most of the conversations usually is around people who are already Christians, and they're just talking about it in like the subculture part, because it is kind of like a culture within itself that is something I probably might have encountered, but in a different way. So it will be differences and similarities.
I've definitely seen memes online pointing to, particular sort of purity codes and not so subtle messaging. Olive, do you want to share your perspective and interactions on purity culture before we tear into our definition here?
Sure. So I was raised in it's hard to describe because purity culture was sort of the water that I swam in growing up. I was raised in an evangelical free denomination for the most part. And the term is something that I've really only recently come into contact with, and even like preparing for this talk today was some of the first time that I've like been actually diving into everything that has been written about it. And so I have lots to say, but I guess I'll say first that just where I'm landing now spiritually is that I'm no longer in the evangelical free denomination. I don't identify as a Christian anymore, but a lot of my Christian upbringing still resonates with me in various kinds of ways. I do consider myself a deeply spiritual person, and I have a deep spiritual practice, but it is not in the sort of Christian frame anymore. And So I've last week we were talking about deconstruction, and I feel like from a religious side of things, I went into that process first, I guess, and then the aspects I am still actively in a process of deconstructing the various things that I was saddled with as a result of growing up in purity culture. So I guess I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, well, and I have to be honest, I can get a little hot on the collar on some of these things. So if I get too wound up, I'm going to ask Jacob, because Jacob is usually my better half anyway. He's usually the cooler head that prevails. But Olive, I know, I know you can get me a little wound up, but you'll add fuel on the fire. So I'm going to try to keep myself in check here as we go forward.
Well, I just want to say too that I feel you on that. And as I've been sort of researching these things, I have been surprised I consider myself to be pretty well progressed beyond a lot of the stuff that I was sort of, raised with, and maybe that's not the best way to put it, but I have spent a lot of time and energy into deconstructing and correcting a lot of these harmful views that I was raised with, but I was still very surprised at how much my body, even right now, and for the last 24 hours that I've been watching all these videos and preparing, that my body has really been reacting. So I will also say that I feel all of this alive currently now, and I may also need to pass the mic at times. So yeah.
Yeah, well, and we'll all try to be aware of our limits and when and if we reach them. All right, so if we're all set, I'm gonna dive into our definition unless I'm missing something. I'm hearing a little bit of static on my line. Is anyone else hearing that?
Nope.
Not significantly, no.
All right, perfect. So here's our definition to start. The term purity culture is generally associated with white American evangelical Christian purity movements and the purity industry launched in the early 1990s. However, evangelicals don't have a monopoly on the ethics and that undergird purity culture. The specifics vary by religion and culture, but gender and sexual control through purity culture exists in global, cross-religious, and in cross-cultural contexts. In purity culture, gender expectations are based on a strict stereotype-based binary. Men are expected to be strong, quote, masculine leaders of the household, church, and to a lesser extent, society. Women are expected to support them to be pretty, quote, feminine, sweet, supportive wives and mothers. I want to add my own little note at the end here that I think that a lot of this often has to do, what do we say, Troy, with a code of respectability, more than it actually has to do with the reading of the gospel. So I'll put that out there, and you all can correct me if you feel like that's the case. But how do we feel about this definition?
I'll be honest. I came in with a different thought of what we would be discussing around the term purity culture because, I definitely see the version that's being put forth here with purity rings and whatnot. I remember that being a big thing when I was a kid.
Promise rings, purity bracelets, and sort of oath. It's like taking an oath of some kind. Wasn't that also sort of in practice?
The whole commodification essentially of purity. But
it's the
also
industry with it, yeah.
At the same time, the term I usually associate with purity culture is more related to I guess the proper term would be ritual purity. And this is kind of what I was thinking of was related to Levitical laws and other things within the Bible that are suggestive of a need for a bodily purity in association with physical purity. I think, well, there's definitely a modern movement we can talk about. We shouldn't entirely detach it from the fact that Abrahamic faiths in general, all three of the major ones and minor ones, have this concept of spiritual and bodily purity that are related to one another. Without this concept, the laws of the Torah make no sense. The ritual washing before prayer in Islam and dietary restrictions make no sense without this concept. And importantly for us here, the idea of a pure Christ who can be sacrificed differently from any impure human individual doesn't make sense. So I think while we can talk about this in a modern context, we have to keep in mind that it isn't just that. It's also the modern manifestation of thousands of years of history of practice that focused on purity as something that made one religiously fit, that is baked into the sacred text we're working with as a base assumption.
I think you make a great point, and I suspect that if I were to challenge a pastor on the biblical veracity of a purity code, that they would go right to those texts and demonstrate that, yes, purity codes have always been a part of things, and I think they would try to stand and deliver on those biblical codes as you described. Floyd Boy, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I resonate a lot with oh my God, I can't say your name, I'm so sorry. Jacob? Yes. That there is a thing, purity culture kind of is sort of dominated by the evangelical, industrial complex of purity culture. There's like a massive machine behind it. But there is this thing of purity of bodily autonomy, which it is very present. And in Jehovah's Witness, they like to take scriptures about what you put in your body, what you do with your body is part of, well, they don't say purity, but they use the word clean, which we can assume they're both made the same thing, right?
Which appears in the Bible as well, yeah.
Yeah, a bunch of times. And is this, and you can say the same thing about Abrahamic religions, where there is this focus on trying to keep the body as clean as possible for your ascendance into like either the paradise or in the heavenly, paradise. There is this kind of need to keep the body pure. And in some cases, they take biblical passages to necessarily prescribe, like you shouldn't put this particular thing in your body because look, it says here in this chapter, in this verse, and the apostle says that you shouldn't have this specific thing in you, therefore, you shouldn't consume it. And it goes with sex. Sex is the big one. Let's face it. Yes, it's the big one. It's the one they care about. It's the one they obsess over. We're not going to sugarcoat it. The scholars, but your average in your day-to-day operations, sex is the big one. So that's where purity conversations sense that is what regular layman people think of and see of when they think about purity culture.
Yeah, I think that there's, and this is something that I want to get into, and I should have mentioned this off the top. Talking about purity culture means we're going to be talking about sex. So, mature themes and mature language are in play here. I'm going to have to check that box when I upload this as our podcast. But I think that purity culture is a lot of times, I feel like, especially if you're a teenager or, you're not married, that it is really about sex. And I think that this is the fundamental flaw. And I'd love to know what you think about this, Olive, that one of the fundamental flaws of purity culture is that whatever you think about the code itself, the way they try to enforce this purity really results to a lot of saying, well, don't think about elephants, don't think about sex. And by saying that, it's almost like you're actually fixating on it when you're presuming to be devoid of it. So I feel like purity culture, right, wrong, or indifferent, when it comes to this sort of teenage prescriptions on not having sex and limited physical intimacy, that they sometimes produce the opposite of the result they're intending. What do you think, Olive?
One of the things I've been thinking about for the last, a little minute that I've been doing this research is who benefited from this? This is such a huge. It's hard really to even like capture the full breadth of how far this reached, because it wasn't just the purity rings, but like there was this whole movement behind it with like huge youth conferences and these ceremonies. And I just don't know exactly like who benefited from this. But I will say that that for me, so I am a queer person, and I found it maybe easier than most to wait until, well, I didn't wait for marriage. I'm not married and I'm no longer a virgin, but I think part of the reason that I in particular found it, maybe easier to wait than others was because I was queer and I didn't know it. And it wasn't even really a thought in my mind per se as to like that wasn't even in the realm of possibility. So for me, like it was very fear based. I'm sure that for other people, the function of the elephant, don't think about the elephant is most certainly true. And I don't doubt that. For me in particular, I think it functioned a little bit differently. The major fear in my family was that of pregnancy. So my mom was always very nervous about me getting pregnant. She was one of 14 children. I come from a line of extremely fertile women. So I think she was always I think she was far more concerned about like the pregnancy aspect. Not that she didn't also want me to be pure, but that's sort of like the angle of fear.
Well, and that sort of answers the who benefits question, right? I think that I'm a father, and I think that things are much easier, or much more simple if you can manage to wait until marriage, but I don't think that's how most practical people are going to do things. So,
okay, easier for the parent, sure.
But I feel like the parents are theoretically the ones who are benefiting because they can buy into a pre-existing culture that has, as I understand it, books and special jewelry and maybe concerts and camps or something. I mean, right. Theoretically, all Christian activities are pure activities. So, like, it sort of feeds into itself in that way. And
are you saying that this is a way for parents to like connect with their kids?
No, I'm saying it's a way for parents to hopefully discourage them from getting pregnant, which as you described was the fear that your parents had. And I imagine a lot of parents have it. I feel like I'm going to have it. So,
and that's the fear. That's the reason that like prohibitions on premarital sex are written into the Bible and whatnot in the first place. Because if you are someone in an ancient society and you don't have contraceptives, a child that you have outside of marriage is a burden on your ability to enter into a marital relationship in the first place, and also it sort of disrupts the whole property law system of the time, where you need,
which is misogyny at its strongest. But yeah, that is a commodification like no other.
Yeah, but also think of it this way: the reason. And this is, I'm not trying to justify a double standard, but the reason the double standard exists between men and women here is that women get pregnant, and if there's not a household structure to take care of them, that goes back on the father's household. That falls on the patriarchal parental structure that exists in these ancient societies, and in many ways has echoes down to today. And so we have to think about it in that context, where premarital sex in the ancient world was a much bigger problem for these societies who are trying to maintain this order and system of managing everything from property to family relations, diplomacy, if you're in a notable position in your society. It's a significantly larger issue when you don't have any form of contraceptives or birth control.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, Jacob. And I also want to toss in there too that for women, I want to read a quick quote from this book called Pure, which is about that whole movement and part of like the reading that I had started around this topic. But so she says, I'll get the author's name in just a minute, but she says, in the evangelical community, an impure girl or woman isn't just seen as damaged, she's considered dangerous, not only to the men that we're told that we must protect by covering up our bodies, but to our entire community. Because if the men, the heads of our households and the leaders of our churches fell, we all fell. And I think that like there's so much pressure and so much responsibility placed on women to carry that burden, where you are responsible not just for the potential pregnancy that having sex, may or may not like saddle you with, but we also place this responsibility on women for like not tempting men in the first place. If something happens, like, she's going to be responsible for that whole thing. But then also everything comes down on her as to like, look at what you're doing to the men if this happens to you.
And that's where this whole thing sort of seems to separate from the gospel, right? Because Jesus puts the onus on the wandering eye, that if the eye wanders, it should be plucked out. Now, that was likely hyperbole. Jesus didn't likely want people to be, doing that to themselves. But the point is that the burden is on the tempted one. And we don't see that reflected in the enforcement of purity culture as I understand it.
And I think that,
again, I am still somewhat outside.
That also ties back into this idea of the stumbling block, which I think has to be mentioned anytime we're talking about purity culture, was the prevalence of this notion of stumbling blocks and of women being stumbling blocks for men. And
we see some misogynistic memes coming out of this, that, I'm so pure, and not being near women and rejecting their wiles, which is to say rejecting them as people often, is somehow a righteous thing to do. And, it can lead into all sorts of internet communities that have unique views on the role of men, we'll say.
For sure. I also just want to mention that this author that I quoted before, her name is Linda K. Klein. She wrote a book called Pure, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free. I started reading this book yesterday, and it is like every single word is just resonating so deeply. And there's so many, it's, I think, really healing to just watch things being laid out in a organized way of somebody that like really dove into all of this stuff. Anyway.
That's where I got my definition from. We're reading from the same book.
It's a worthy
I have
one.
a comment here. I have a comment here from Secret Heathen. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he makes a really good point that the reputation of, and I think all of you were sort of pointing towards this, that the reputation of the teenager, and perhaps more so a female teenager, is not only her reputation, but the reputation of her parents. And that if it were known that the reputation of the teenage daughter was besmirched, that those parents' reputation, at least in the circles of the church, would be diminished. And I think this again returns us to, whether or not something is directly based off the Bible, it function as a sort of politics of respect. Or disrespect, as it seems is likely in a lot of cases. To what extent? So this is my question: to what extent is this purity code what Jacob described? This sort of whether you think it's a vestige of a distant past or something we still need to have, that it's this tradition of purity, or are we just sort of enforcing norms and random ways and times? Like, are we just running with what we think is good, grabbing a Bible and saying, well, it checks out because XYZ is a stumbling block, or this person is a stumbling block, or these kind of people are a stumbling block? Is this all just parents projecting their fears and grabbing a Bible to do it?
Well, I don't think it's accurate to say it's random, because it definitely has cultural trends that move both in the present and from the past, and thinking about the future in how parents plan for their kids. However, I do think that it is maintained by parental anxiety, because, and not that some people also don't participate in it by choice. There's also a very large contingent we should acknowledge here who, see it as important for themselves. I have a friend who got married a few years ago, and he decided he never wanted to kiss before marriage. So he dated his girlfriend for several years, and they never kissed until they were on that stage together. And as far as I know, they don't regret it. So there is that I cannot speak to that at all. I am very, very active. But like there is an appeal there for some people. And I think we should acknowledge that. But as far as parental enforcement of it, yeah, it is enforced by anxiety, but those anxieties are not random. They exist because of a zeitgeist that exists. And a zeitgeist that allows them
to communicate. I think you make a good point, but also, can't we say that choosing not to kiss someone is random? It seems pretty random that this person decided, and that's fine. I'm not saying it's not legitimate, but what I'm saying is that it's more preferential than it is growing out of a biblical tradition. And I think that we see unique twists on these purity codes, like the rings, like the books, like I don't know that there's movies, but I feel like there's been like concert worship sort of praise style experiences around these things, that we see a lot of industry around it. But I feel like it's a subculture of Christianity, and that because it's like that, I'm not trying to delegitimize it, but I am trying to say that it has so many unique twists and turns. It's hard to say that it's all one thing sometimes. And I think your friend who doesn't want to kiss is a perfect example.
Yeah, but I think I would simply clarify how I prefer to use the term random, which is that we can't see what feeds into it and what pulls out of it, right? Because I think that that culture is fundamentally non-random. Humans might be unpredictable because we're just so complicated, but at the end of the day, we get ideas from somewhere, and sometimes I think choosing to abstain from things like that is, if anything, picking up on the current that exists of purity culture and deciding to go further in a sort of test of self. So I wouldn't call it random. I would call it participating, but innovating in a way.
Okay. So, and I think you're making some great points. I'd like to see how, let's return to this question of randomness or perhaps unique instances when we shift in a couple minutes towards the media side. Castor Troy, it seems like you were trying to say something earlier.
Oh, and I was just thinking, we've kind of hit on a bunch of different points. Just to go back a little bit further, when I was asking who benefits from this, and we've kind of all touched it. We also have to keep in mind, like, it's very cynical and kind of cliche, but follow the money. Like, these things aren't done out of pure heart, pure cloth. Like, no, we want to make sure everyone's pure. Like, people are finding ways to, commercially benefit off of these things. People sell these rings. People sell attendance to these concerts. If you can sell an idea of something, you can then sell the merch that goes along with it on the back end. So while some parent might be benefiting by going, nope, I'm making sure my daughter's not getting pregnant, some other mega church is now benefiting off of, great, we get to sell more tickets to this concert that I know this teenager doesn't want to go to, but their parents feel better because they went. And that's the cycle of where that tends to come from. And then there's, like, I agree with Jacob. I don't want to fully call these acts random, but because they all essentially fall back onto some form of abstinence or penance, like proving or earning the right to call yourself this other thing. And in the evolving world that we live in, it's kind of not, it's one of those unsaid things that, well, it's not fair to expect people to not fully touch. But if we say we haven't kissed, that's us earning. That is us showing our version of this form of abstinence to then.
It's demonstrating your purity.
This is our way to demonstrate our purity in a world where that demonstration seems rare, or because everybody's a heathen and just making out in the streets. It's the counterbalance to that. So that was what I was going to hop in with before we moved on.
Yeah, I was that thing. What it's still in my head. It's like this performance. It's this performance of appearing to be pure. Like it is being on
which is
stage,
something Christians get accused of in other departments. So it's a bit of a theme.
Why do I need to be on stage to prove people that I've been a kissless and then show it in front of people? Look at me. Look how pure I am. I get it that there's kind of like a social need, right? A feeling to belong within your group because, this is seen as a good thing. It is beneficial for us. But the need to perform seems to be a little suspicious. And we're right to be kind of talking about and questioning how beneficial truly is to this, like to the spiritual health of a person, of a couple, of somebody who wants to build a family, and of expression of faith. Like, sometimes the Bible goes a little bit wacky when it comes to pure purity. I don't know. I hate to pull out the Bible, but there's this fun little passage I like to bring up when talking about purity culture. Matthew chapter 5, verses 28. In the New Testament version says, "But I say to you, guys, that everyone that keeps on looking at a woman as to have a passion for her has already committed adultery." So that means our married couples. But we can just also use adultery and say fornication with her in his heart. So he's saying like even thinking about sex or thinking about adultery is already seen as like a bad. Don't put that thought in your head. That thought bad. Like we can also put that in the purity culture bucket. Like it's a little wacky. I don't know. This is like my thought on that. This whole need to perform, to prove, to show people. I don't have bad thoughts. I don't do bad things in my head, even though I do. Sorry.
Well, I definitely raise an eyebrow at it, but I think we also have instances, if you really value marrying someone with the same system of values that you have, then, the guy who says we're not going to kiss until we get married in that church, and the girl that says, yes, I'm on board, no matter what happens, they know, well, at least when they started, they were starting with the same set of values. And part of me thinks that that's sort of part of it, how I don't know. It does still seem like going to the Don't Think About Elephants convention to me. But I know that I've heard stories about people that get married and they really struggle with their sexuality because it's not something they explored. But of course, if the people who are going home and doing just fine, you probably don't hear about them either. So I don't want to delegitimize anyone's experience, but I don't think everyone is having a great time, and I don't think everyone is having a miserable time either.
Yeah, I don't want to butt in too much, but I would suggest that reading that passage, we should. I think take it in the context of, like earlier we mentioned the pulling out of the eye. There's also just also refers to situations like removing a plank from your eye, or forgiving someone 7 times 7 times. I think that that when we read these passages that feel extreme, the reason they feel extreme is for the effect, the strengthening of the effect of what is being asked, which is the idea of going above and beyond for goodness by choice in order to monitor yourself. Jesus doesn't actually talk here about showing off the fact that you're not looking at other women. He simply says, don't spend the time of your mind thinking about it, because you are already committing these sins in your heart, that is, committing them in your will to commit them, which is less about the effects they have on others, but more about the effect that it has on you and what you ultimately want to do in society. So I think in a lot of ways you can read this as a purity statement, but you can also read it in the sense of better yourself above and beyond what society expects, including in the internal parts of yourself rather than just your outward performance.
It gets a little tricky when I've been in situations where we don't call them pastors, we call them elders, have used this in to justify things of purity culture. And I feel like the reason why I say like action and then thought, Jesus wasn't necessarily talking about that yet. There's a lot of metaphors and a lot of poetry in the Bible, but it's the use of this passage that I feel propagates things of purity culture. It obviously, any passage can be used incorrectly to motivate or move things along a certain direction. And I feel like passages like this have been used as almost like a blunt instrument. And it makes sense to me why people feel this need to, I must show it. It's not enough for me to be by myself. Like, I think in certain spaces, you might agree, right? There are certain spaces where it's probably necessary or expected for you to perform these purity acts, not just being by yourself and try to be as good as a person as possible within you. Meditate, because you can do that. But it gets tricky when it's like a large group of people and they're all showing like their purity and their devotion in like a very physical.
It becomes like,
mm-hmm.
it becomes like this like circular thing, right? Like everybody's kind of watching each other perform purity and be like, well, yeah. I'm just as pure as that person and even more, and so like there's oh man, there's a really good meme of where everybody's pointing the guns at each other. That's reminding me of a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yes, the Spider-Man pointing at the other Spider-Man.
Yes, thank you.
As Drax put it, I am extraordinarily humble.
So humble. And I think like a lot of what we're talking about is how sometimes Christian culture can get away from what's actually in the Bible, and these conventions get placed around things. Like just as a random example, like growing up, I remember the reason that we weren't supposed to say "Oh my God" was it was like, don't take the Lord's name in vain, and it's like the you just made up that's what that means. Like the verse that they're pointing back to about that, it can be interpreted in so many ways, but sometimes I think we point at these particular verses and we're like, this is what that means, so this is what you need to do with your body. And I think especially when it comes to like controlling women in particular and saying what women should and shouldn't do with our bodies, again, like the onus being put on us to such an extent. And I also wanted to point out too that like there's something very when we think about the culture kind of running away from maybe the original intent or maybe like the actual theological underpinning that it came from, there's this idea that for some reason that like sexual purity and especially like virginity is a thing that is sort of like a sin that you can only like that is not like forgivable in a way, like we have this view that that under
there does seem to be a distinct lack of forgiveness in these formulas.
Right. Because for some reason giving your virginity is thought to sort of like fundamentally change you in some way, right? So like we believe that like, or the culture says that Christ can forgive you of murder, but if you are, once you give your virginity, like that's it's gone forever, and you are fundamentally changed. And I think there are so many object lessons that a lot of us that grew up in that purity culture we're kind of subject to. And the object lesson can take all different kinds of forms, but there's like the chewed gum, or like the licked Oreo, or the the licked cupcake.
Various metaphors for you are now less a person because you failed XYZ purity code.
And not just less, but like fundamentally damaged. Right? The idea that you are like...
sorry.
Go ahead, Jacob.
I was going to say, some people don't always take it metaphorically either. Like, I love the subreddit r/bad women's anatomy. If you look at that, you can see that a lot of people think that like virginity is a real physical thing. And it is scarily pervasive in our culture how many people think that women's bodies are like actually physically changed the moment they have sex.
Right. And I think a lot about like how much trauma and horrible situations have resulted out of, even something that, I mean, the closest anatomical thing that we can point to is like the hymen, right? And throughout history, and Jacob, I'm sure you can speak to this pretty well, is that like, the hymen has been pointed to as being the thing that proves you're a virgin. But there's so many women that are born without a hymen, or it breaks because they're physically active, or whatever it is. And even still, that's still in practice in certain places in the world as well. And man, I was just watching recently the movie Memoirs of a Geisha, and that came up in that movie. And I was thinking about that, where I was like, oh my gosh, it's such a worldwide thing that's just plain wrong. But again, circling back to like the idea that once you are no longer a virgin, that you are like fundamentally damaged in some way and fundamentally changed, and that you can never quite, get that back. And, and I think that's like, there is something to be said for that, because like sex is and should be treated with respect and reverence. And because it is a big deal, for a lot of people. For other people, it really isn't a big deal. And I think that we need to respect that as well. But I would say that murder also probably fundamentally changes a person. But we don't tend to talk about that in the same way.
That's something I wanted to, I finish your thought, but there's a point after that I want to get to about this whole forgiveness and how we're sort of defining sins.
Yeah, I think that is a really valid and important thing to talk about. Like, how do we define sin? And also, like, why is this in a different category? You know what I mean? And
well, I think we have some categorical issues. I think that a lot of things are getting heaped under as lust. And I've seen and talked to a fair number of people about, various struggles with lust. But I feel like we have a problem where we're so focused on teenagers not, going too far, or not becoming pregnant, or not having sex with each other. But we're forgetting that we have issues with adults, that Jesus was very clear that divorce is not allowed. And that does happen. And we don't hear about those people I don't hear about those people being outcast, although I know the Catholic Church does that sometimes. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but there's also instances of abuse in the church. And if we had industries and books and conferences about the abuse in the church, I think we'd be in a much better place. But it seems, and that's something that, has been touched. No denomination, as far as I'm aware, has had zero instances of abuse. That this is something that Christians share. And I just find it really suspect that we're so focused on teenagers and what they are or are not doing, when we have adults that are, committing sins that Jesus was very clear about, and also, abusing and traumatizing people. So I'm sorry to take it to such a heavy place, but I feel like when we categorize everything as lust, I think we're being really hard on some folks, and I think we end up letting other folks off the hook. So feel free to call me out on that, and then we're going to shift towards the sort of media side of this.
Yeah, I think when you mention lust, there is a mechanical use of it. People tend to put I think Olive already mentioned this earlier, but it is in a lot of evangelical circles, and this is true. Um, the onus is on the woman to control the lust of the men. She bears the responsibility on the lust of the men. And men are seemingly given a pass. They can be as lustful as possible because they have these male urges that are exclusive to men for some reason. Apparently, women cannot have sexual urges either. And they cannot control themselves. They simply cannot. So women, cover yourself and be as asexual, unsexy as possible to preserve your purity and your virginity. And
But you're also supposed to be sexy enough to attract a husband, but not so sexy that you. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there. But
yeah, you must be wife material and be able to bear children, right? So it's like a bunch of stuff.
Right, it's the come closer, don't touch me.
Exactly.
Well, and it's also a place where sort of bigotry and ignorance seeps in, right? I mean, we have an entire subreddit that last I knew called Not How Women Work for exactly the sort of stuff that we've been describing here, that people genuinely don't know and have all sorts of bizarre expectations that biologically are not sound.
It's also important to remember, I think, that I think the reason that we see this focus on males controlling themselves is in part because, for one, the entire biblical text is written by men. And two, for most of the history of Christianity, most branches have had exclusively male clergy. And that, there were women clergy in early Christianity, there are women clergy today, and there are women clergy throughout the history, but they were definitely not the majority, and you were often systematically considered disallowed. So the people who have been teaching, according to both their own experiences and according to the experiences of their expected audience, have had a male normalcy on this discussion. The idea of women being attracted to people is not something that most people who are doing the speaking in advocacy of purity culture systems have been experiencing from the perspective of women.
Yeah, and that expectation
Well
that
said.
women, yeah, agreed. And there's that expectation that women are, well, first of all, like this objectification of women too, that it's like the problem of women, like being, whatever it is that we are, but something other than fully human, right? And it's like, oh, you are doing this, you're doing that, you're causing men to stumble, but also you're supposed to sort of be this pure wife material kind of a thing. And I lost my thought. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, there's definitely a lot of contradictions. And I feel like this, we've talked about the biblical basis of all this. And I think something that's true, at least according to the notes I've been reading on my Bibles, is that Jesus speaks in hyperbole. And what you and your denomination does with that hyperbole, is probably going to make a significant difference in how you approach some of these things. Before we get to the Super Bowl halftime show, I want to go back. Go ahead,
Sorry,
Olive, and then we'll shift to the media component.
I was saying that I was thinking that the that expectation of women to be sort of like receptive in a way where it's like we are supposed to sort of hang back and like wait to be like chosen by a man, and that extends like not just in like the social space also, but like once it comes into the bedroom as well. Like I, even now at 37 years old, haven't identified as a Christian for over a decade, but I still have to remind myself every single time I'm in the bedroom with somebody that like I am an equal participant in that interaction, and that it is an equal give and take of, and I think that those expectations run really deep, and a lot of that stuff really, it takes a lot of undoing, because so much of it is subconscious, and so much of it is just sort of expectations that you don't even necessarily have a name for. You don't realize it's happening until you see the effects of it in your life later, and you're like, oh dang, like that it is, you can trace the roots back. And but anyway, I think the overall expectation that women are to be like sort of receptive, and that we are not like the advocates for our own destinies runs really deep, like through patriarchy, through, you know, everything, but has so many little branches into every aspect of purity culture.
So we talked a bit about the sort of commodification from the ancient commodification, which is super direct, to our more modern uses of like movies, concerts, sort of social gatherings, purity rings. So I want to talk about the Super Bowl halftime show because I think it attracts a certain sort of satanic panic, which is another subject we'll have to save for another time. But one of the first times I saw purity culture in the pop culture was based around video games. First, I saw it around Mortal Kombat. And honestly, I kind of get it with Mortal Kombat. I enjoyed the game, but it was definitely, had a level of realism, had a level of violence that was unique, and still is unique, I believe. But then it moved to Pokemon, and I was really confused. And it seemed to me, at first I heard things like, oh, well, Pokemon evolved and evolution is not, Christian according to certain Christians, so they didn't like that. Other people said, well, they're pocket monsters. Monsters are demons, so you're collecting demons and it's a demonic game. But it seems to me that the real problem that pastors and parents had with the Pokemon when it first came out, at least, was that it was more popular than their church was, that it was more interesting maybe than their pastor had managed to make Jesus. And I feel like, so that's my impression from inside the house. What do you think, Troy, about this sort of 90s sort of labeling something as satanic or demonic because, well, for whatever reason it might be? And I think, Jacob, you were right when you said it's not random. I think this is a perfect example of why it's not random, because it's, from where I sit, it seems like they don't like the competition, so they're trying to slander it.
You hit the nail on the head. I mean, you know way more than I do, but false idols and idolatry and all that sort of thing. That's usually where this springs from if you're taking from the church moving outward. So if we go back to go back all the way to the 90s, where you talk about the Mortal Kombats or the Simpsons or the Beavis and Buttheads of the world, and the things that start to become mainstream popular, but in a way that the church can get literally behind and say, nope, this is the bad thing we can say is the bad thing now, because it's popular enough that the parents that are in the audience will be able to readily recognize it. They might not be able to pick every album, every show, every cartoon that would probably fit more into their, hey, be careful, your kids are watching this thing. But if it's the highest rated show on TV and all the kids, quote unquote, are watching it, if it's the biggest game out and all the kids, quote unquote, are playing it, you can now hit that zeitgeist point and say, hey, this is the thing that's going to turn your children. This is the thing you should be afraid of. Where it starts to get shaky is the lines for what creates that. The rules get really thin. And so I'm glad you use Pokemon, where it's like, oh, well, the word monster's in there. That's bad. And the same thing, it's under fire now.
Early Pokemon had its issues. Like, I think the most legitimate claim you could say about early Pokemon is like, hey, isn't that dogfighting? And dogfighting is bad, isn't it? Like, and it's much better now. It's much more wholesome.
Like, when I was a kid, that wasn't the angle being played by parents to keep you from playing Pokemon. It was just, no, the church said that was Satan, that's Satan stuff. And the same thing happened when Harry Potter started getting popular. Like, nope, that's witchcraft, that's the occult. Never mind some of the other stuff that they could actually say was bad in there. They're like, nope, just broad strokes that doesn't fit the rule. And so to bring it all to fruition with the Super Bowl halftime show, you said there's a satanic panic that usually happens along with that. Yes and no. It depends on who the performer is for the most part, but it happens largely because the Super Bowl is the closest thing we have to a national holiday that's not a holiday, and that it casts a very wide net of people that interact with that probably wouldn't. So I go to plenty of Super Bowl parties where maybe half the people in the room in that house don't care about football. They're watching for the halftime show. They're watching for the commercials. So with that, you're going to get a whole bunch of people that are like, wait, Rihanna's performing? Oh, she was that wholesome girl from 2002 that was dancing around a little bit. And then they see her performance, like, wait, she's wearing red. She's doing like very sexually overt songs. Kids shouldn't be watching this, even though they're fine with watching kids watch grown men give each other CCE all day. anything that's remotely sexual is now off the table. And you're getting people whose eyes are now on it from that perspective, and they start to kick up dust. But I've also noticed in the text I sent you the other day, I was like, I didn't realize it was that big of a backlash to it. And it turns out there isn't. It's the quintessential example of a vocal minority. And I think it was Fox that aired it. They said, yes, we had like literally hundreds of millions of people watched the Super Bowl halftime show or just watched the game in general. They had less than 1,000 total correspondents that were negative about the purity of the show. But that's going to pick up the noise because that's that they want people to interact with it just to get behind whatever they're trying to galvanize.
Troy, can I give you a fun statistic?
Sure.
So you mentioned hundreds of millions of Americans have watched the Super Bowl. You know how many complaints the FCC got for the performance of Rihanna?
It was like 100, right?
103.
See? It was like 100 people.
Like, it doesn't seem statistically significant to me.
Yeah,
exactly.
At least one of which classified the performance as pornography.
But see, and that's all it takes because of the ease to amplify very small voices now through social media, through anything. We know all about those 100 people that complain. It's like, oh man, all these people are talking about the backlash of the halftime show, and it's literally 103 people. But it's 103 people with internet access, so somebody can pick that up and amplify it, even though, again, not really statistically significant. So that's where we're at now in some regards to purity panic.
Well, and I'm told that the Katy Perry halftime show, which I don't remember particularly, was that the one with the sharks? I don't know.
Yes.
There was one that I think there are certain folks who call themselves Christian and probably, are to an extent, but they have a fixation on things that are quote unquote satanic. And I think you're right. I think it is a smaller group of people. But I think there are those people who clutch pearls and say, oh, well, if someone says it is, then perhaps it is.
Well, and also, or especially in the Katy Perry instance, she was a little bit less so now just because how her career is shaken out. But she was a very overtly sexual artist who had roots in gospel and Christian music. Her start was as for her father's church, she was a Christian singer. So they've been throwing barbs at her since she went mainstream pop from the beginning. So then her, she's up there, she's dancing and blah, blah. But really, that was the most milquetoast. Nothing was very out there about Katy Perry's halftime show, which was like 10 years ago now. But she was still the one they turned against. So it's like, nope, she's on the stage doing that secular music. We got to take her down. And that's all that really was.
I mean, let's not forget the Janet Jackson debacle, Super Bowl situation. That everybody seems to forget.
That's largely the start of the panic around the halftime show. And that's when the NFL kind of switched MOs a bit and tried to go super old or go tend more to the boomer crowd. But then the ratings for the halftime show specifically plummeted because they were putting acts out there that, with all due respect to the artist, nobody really wanted to see at the middle of of a football game.
Fun fact, did you know that the halftime artists at the Super Bowl are not paid?
I did know that. Most people don't. That is
paid in exposure, just like so many artists.
I was absolutely aghast when I learned that. I mean, for the most part, artists that are performing there are doing just fine, but still, it's the point of the matter.
So I want to ask you guys. So I felt like, because I didn't really have too much of a purity culture within, my own denomination, that I noticed the Pokemon thing because I think it got some news coverage, quote unquote news coverage. But what was held up as good things, like in your faith traditions? If Pokemon and halftime shows are the slippery slope to Satan, then what is it that was held up in the community, other than the Bible and the pastor, as something worth checking out? VeggieTales? I'm not sure.
Jennifer Knapp.
Yeah, I was going to say quite literally nothing. And I'm saying that there's a very limited scope that I have for this just in terms of that time, because I grew up poor black kid in the inner city. So they were very much afraid of everything we were interacting with, whether it was hip hop, whether it was the clothes we were wearing, whether it was watching wrestling. Everything was like, no, if you do that, you're going to turn to the drugs. You're going to be a gang member. So all they were putting up against it, and I hate to use the term against, was the church, was come listen to gospel, come to these lock-ins where we put a bunch of horned up preteens together and sure, nothing's going to happen. Like that's the type of thing they were giving us as alternatives.
Oh, geez.
And they were completely surprised. I was like, wait, no, they're making out more when we lock them all together. It's like, yeah.
It's an up all night not thinking about elephants party. I don't understand what could go wrong.
But they were never giving us actual, I mean, for lack of a better term, cool alternatives. It was just more church stuff. It was more school stuff. It's like, hey, isn't this back to school special cool? It's like, no, we want to listen to rap like our friends are doing. Like, this is super corny and off. And they were pushing more of us away with their alternatives because they were not meeting us in the middle. They were completely washing away everything that we would remotely actually like and only presenting the most parent-approved versions of everything. We wanted Captain Crunch, and they were giving us Berry Berry Kicks. Like, that's all they could offer.
Yeah, and it also, for me, I just want to say this real quick, it also kind of, it's a little bit insulting that you cannot process mature, complicated themes, right? Because I don't think we give the younger people more credit of their ability to process really complicated and heavy subjects. And like, I mean, the Bible is chock full of really weird, difficult things. And guess what? They use poetry, they use music to express it. So,
Amen.
like, there's a need for that.
The version of this I experienced as a dinosaur kid was the incredible amount of like creationist dinosaur materials that exist. And I have made the decision throughout my life to never get rid of any of them. So I have like a big collection of 90s movies and books about dinosaurs that are created basically as a young Earth creationist counters to the fact that in the like post Jurassic Park, post Walking with Dinosaurs era, kids loved dinosaurs more than anything else.
That's amazing.
And so I have a bunch of these, and this exists because there was a panic that like kids are overwhelmingly learning about evolution by their own will more than any ever before, and it's going to corrupt our morals, it's going to destroy society, etc. Right?
Oh, I have a fun story about that as well. When I was in 1994 is when Jurassic Park came out. I was in third grade. And because Jurassic Park was so popular, it got a lot of, like you're talking about, a lot of renewed interest in kids into dinosaurs. And so the next year, my class took a field trip to like the Science Museum that was doing this very cool dinosaur exhibit in Connecticut. And they had like animatronic dinosaurs. There was like a little play that they put on, and you learned so much about the dinosaurs. And I remember there was this group of kids that could not go because their parents were and I don't know which religion or denomination they were part of, but in the town I was living in, they put a foot down and said, our kids cannot learn about evolution. This is in Connecticut in the mid 90s, but but like you're calling out, a lot of evangelicals latched onto Jurassic Park as the bad thing for kids to learn about. Jurassic Park now. So like I want to say it ended up being like only like 20 kids total throughout the school because it was a huge school trip. So it was only 20 kids total. But still to think like, oh yeah, there are kids that are actively, or families that are actively against their child's education now because someone whipped them up into a frenzy about the dangers of learning about evolution. And like that's literally what that through line was. And it's wild to think that, yeah, it's because Jurassic Park was a popular movie. That's what they use to galvanize people in a negative way. So weird.
Yeah. Again, I think this
It
is
was
another
taking attention
example,
away from Jesus.
right? Of where like the culture kind of gets away from the important part of the whatever it was that it started with it. I remember being in high school. Speaking of like anti-evolution things, like I was literally a senior in high school in an AP psychology class, and I wrote a paper I found somewhere on the internet evidence against evolution, and wrote an entire paper, like a 4-page paper. I was 18 years old. Like, what? But I regarding like, you know, which media is okay and is not okay, we my indoctrination and my like brainwashing was very thorough, I guess, to the point where like it was both an internal thing for me where I was very hesitant about consuming anything that had a secular label. And And to be fair, anything with a secular label was like anything that was not produced from within the Christian bubble.
Literally anything else.
Literally anything else. Yeah, exactly. So I, growing up, I was listening to bands like Five Iron Frenzy and Jennifer Knapp, and Jars of Clay was my first music love, like the first music where I was like, oh my God, this is good music, and it's also Christian music, but it's also good and creative, and made really interesting musical choices. And that, I mean, I'm a musician now and a music therapist, and I that had like such a major effect on me. But the music that I had been used to up until Jars of Clay was like kind of boring. Like, I remember I had a friend in high school who was sort of like, he would come with us to youth group sometimes, but he was a drummer. And one time he was like, why is your music so repetitive? Like, they just keep saying the same thing over and over. And I was like, we're like, I didn't really have a good answer, but I was like, it's because it's, it's for a different purpose, but literally it is for a different purpose. And, but the amount of safeguarding of media within the Christian bubble is like very, very intense.
I had a friend who would love kind of listening to repetitive kind of music, and their reasoning was, well, it kind of puts you in a trance. It helps you meditate and think about and keep your head empty.
I think there's some validity to that. Sure. I mean, I love listening to music now that's kind of a little bit repetitive, or maybe like background or something. But this friend was talking about like, singing Lord, I Lift Your Name on High 50 times in a row.
Yeah, that's a stretch. Sorry.
Yeah, well, there seems to be some blurred lines when genres like Christian rock and praise music, and it all can become, from my view, I've been exposed to it a bit. I worked some places that were strict Christian rock music only places. So yeah, I wonder if praise just sneaks its way in with might be music.
The Christian rock industry is major, like just very, very intense, and like that's a whole nother world and a whole nother topic too, for sure.
It's always interesting, especially when I hear, like, I remember not when Christian rock got big, but like there's always like this ebb and flow where like it starts to bump up against popular culture, like at popular mainstream culture again. And I always find it interesting, and this is where kind of like a two America situation, because growing up mostly I wasn't super in the church, but I was around gospel music and that kind of more the everyday culture. In the late 90s, early thousands, like Black gospel music was getting radio play. Like Kirk Franklin went like triple platinum with his songs, and it was very clearly gospel music, but he made it sound like he made it sound like the hip hop and R&B that people were already listening to, and that became a thing. And yes, there was some pushback from the older folks, like, that sounds too much like secular music. And Kirk Franklin was like, nah, secular music is where the kids are. Let's meet them there. And it can still uplift and praise and still ride the line of what Christian music is, but it doesn't have to be stodgy and boring and push them away. And it's always weird because when I hear Christian rock, I'm like, it's like you don't want to commit to just being good music that's also faith-based. You're trying to specifically be Christian rock, which has its own sound, which doesn't get people involved. And I've always I can never put my finger on why they just don't go whole hog with it and just make like, hey, we sound like whatever the hot bands are, but we're singing about Jesus. Like, I can't figure out why there's always that disconnect.
Is it because of Creed? Because Creed tried to do the mainstream thing and it aged like sour milk?
Well, now we have to make an argument. Was Creed ever actually good? Like that's a whole different conversation.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. That's an important question, actually.
I think there's also a relevant detail here, which is that I think there was more variety in the Christian music industry a few decades ago, before giants like Hillsong sort of conglomerated everything. I think part of what we see as Christian music today is the aftermath of the industry becoming huge, centralizing, and listening to the voices that were dissatisfied with certain aspects of it and sanitizing things. I feel like when I was growing up, there was a lot of experimentation that, and maybe this is just my bubble changing a little, but if you tune into a Christian radio station nowadays anywhere in rural America, you'll get kind of the same slow guitar background songs over and over again that, about generic concepts like grace and mercy and stuff. When I remember going to church and we'd rock out to stories from the Bible in song form, or like, there might be an electric guitar, there might be a drum solo, there might be a slow song thrown in there. I think that there is this business side here that listens to the media purity lobby, which is massive from consumers, and responds to it heavily.
Yeah, and I think there's also a similar pattern that happened with the music industry in general, even outside of Christian music, where the record labels do not have nearly as much money right now to play around with as they used to. And so they used to have really extensive arms of their labels that were, finding and cultivating really interesting, good music. But nowadays, honestly, like they can really only, maybe it's not a fair statement to say that they can only afford to go with what they know is going to be popular, but because there's plenty of money there to be had. But that industry as a broad brush has also shifted as well.
I have a question about television. Has Christian television ever been a thing? Like, I'm sure there's Christian TV channels somewhere, but like all I can think of is Touched by an Angel in the 90s. Seemed
oh my god,
at least vaguely
I
Christian.
forgot about that.
The Christian TV industry is massive. It's just the channels are ones that we're probably not the target audience for.
That's the thing.
We're probably mostly too young here.
I was going to say the thing about most Christian art in that way is like they always exist and they're always in large number, but they're always large numbers in their silos. So like we talked about this about religion and media before. We mentioned like Passion of the Christ, which was one of the highest grossing movies of all time. But a lot of that is largely because church groups went in droves. And it's like, oh, wait, these people.
I was one of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the same thing with the TV. They have their, like Jake was saying, they have their channels. You just don't watch them. And they don't have the same cultural footprint of. It's not like you're going to see a whole bunch of trending topics about evangelical TV. They watch it. That's the thing that they consume. But on the flip side of that, a lot of the standards and practices that make up what TV is, even to this day, are based on basically Christian views when that was the held up as this is how everybody thinks. This is the standards and practices for everybody. It was basically just old, like waspy evangelical stuff. So the reason you can't say certain swear words on TV is based out of Christianity, based out of faith, based out of evangelicals. The reason certain shows exist the way they do, like the most popular sitcoms up until a certain point were about the nuclear family and how they solve problems that way. And it's all very safe and milquetoast until you start to get some deviations in the 80s and the 90s. And a lot of those rules are still largely in place. So you mentioned Touched by an Angel, but there were still shows like Seventh Heaven. There were still shows like
I forgot about the Seventh Heaven. Yeah.
As that, but like Full House would be a faith-based show. Like that's the show that moms and dads from across the country, whether they went to church or not, got in front of and watched. And that was one of these safe shows. And so they were sprinkled in throughout TV forever. What starts to throw it off is the same thing that throws off TV in general now is streaming. There's not just one place where everybody watches TV anymore. So the foothold of what standards and practices are don't fully exist in that way anymore. Kids aren't all just watching TGIF on a Friday night because their parents said. They're mostly watching stuff on YouTube. They're mostly watching stuff on their own time and not at one recognized appointment viewing thing anymore. And so the foothold of what standards and practices and what evangelical TV would be are probably as lost in the woods as everybody else is about it. Because how do you get these eyes if they're all over the place?
Sentient Gorilla also adds Walker, Texas Ranger, which I think holds up some of those purity standards for men. And what's his name? Chuck Norris got a lot of love as a result of that show, I think.
Yeah. I want to give a shout out to Prince of Egypt.
That's a great movie. Great movie.
Solid movie, but it played into the slandering of my boy Ramses the Great. But that's a side thing.
There
We
is
have a Ramses sympathizer in the house, everyone.
it's this there is like a lot of historical basis to, like, you know, paint Ramses worse than he actually was. There are some little archaeological debates on that, which is really fun.
Well, yeah, he's also only he's only attached with the Exodus story because it refers to the Hebrews building the city of Pyramesi, which is associated with him. He doesn't even make sense, like, historically. This is a side thing, and I don't want to drag the whole thing off topic, but he doesn't make sense historically as a pharaoh of the Exodus because Egypt ruled Canaan in his rule, so they would have been fleeing to Egyptian rule. So it doesn't make sense. Anyway, side note, media.
Yes. I know Princess Egypt was a really good one that was like very Christian, and a lot of people loved it. And it, you know, telling stories of like Christian faith that was like super cool. Even though this was more like Hebrew and Israel, it kind of ties back into that. And also weird. I always remember, I will never forget how incredibly Christian Chronicles of Narnia was. Like, the lion is literally Jesus. Like, he dies, gets resurrected. Like, that stone tablet in that temple gets cracked in half. It's too freaking obvious that this is like they called like the kids the first Adams and the girls the first Eves on purpose. Like, it's very, very, very Christian. But it's also like, oh, but it's fantasy, you know, there's lions, but God from the Bible, the Hebrew God, yeah, he's real, by the way, but there's magic and fairies.
It gets so blatant that in I believe it's the Voyage of the Dawn Treader in the book, when they get to the edge of the world, Aslan literally says to them, "I exist in your world too by another name. You can find me."
Exactly. And what's Lord of the Rings, very, very Christian on purpose. Like, Jules Tolkien was very Christian, and he was constantly reminding you of it in his books.
Can I pose a question to the group?
Go ahead.
So I'm just wondering if, you know, when I think about like the purity culture of the 90s, especially, which is kind of like the height of it, right? Like late 90s through like mid 2000s, there was just this whole slew of money being thrown at these kinds of things, and artists like Jennifer Knapp were being asked to like write an album about like purity, and so I know that, you know, there's not necessarily as pointed of an effort these days, but I'm sure that like those people and those interests are still there. So I'm curious where folks feel like that money has gone and where those efforts are focused now.
Lobbying.
I would say, yeah, in the kind of how we just talked about how the channels that we don't watch and the radio that we don't listen to, it's going to those places. And I say they like this is a big nefarious thing, but those industries have found a way to speak directly to their audiences in such a way where they don't actually have to go through the mainstream as much to try and corral them in those other instances. They don't have to pay the artist to then try to get on mainstream radio. They're like, no, we have our steady fountain right here. We just have to re-up how we talk to them every now and again. So I think the money is still being funneled in those ways, just way more directly now, kind of in the way that you would do market research or any sort of influencer kind of works in their own silos. And then occasionally it sprinkles out and maybe gets some more. I think that the lobbying happens so much so and so effectively behind a veil that we don't pay attention to, that we don't even realize that it's still thriving and going strong. We're just not, they've given up on us. So we're not even on the purview anymore.
So I think we're just kind of forgetting something that we all do notice here, possibly ignoring the elephant in the room very consciously, but I'm going to jump into the most controversial topic we've discussed tonight. To reference the most popular media man in the United States, figures like Tucker Carlson air these mindsets directly, regularly, moral panic rhetoric throughout households everywhere. They are the direct end result of this sort of thing. When they talk about the threats to Western civilization that are coming through, you know, M&M's not wearing the proper shoes or whatever, it's exactly that mindset. It's the mindset that the culture is dangerous and corrupt. And frankly, programming like that would not function if it wasn't part of this media sphere that has been building through the Satanic Panic, and before that through McCarthyism, and various other ideas of, the idea of moral decline, which in the digital age, which upkeeps the very conspiracy theories that figures like him refer to. He's even referenced the Great Replacement and whatnot, which is very much circulated on the internet. The very quickly changing world and changing media world that the viewers experience makes for an evolution of these ideas into the mainstream. And the reason we don't see the same panic when we look for it here is simply because we're so used to it as background noise, literally in the living rooms across America.
Well, there's plenty of memes about degeneracy. Like, there's plenty of memes that are Christian memes, and obviously that's what we deal in. But there's also memes that fancy themselves Christian memes that never mention Christianity, but they nod towards a moral code or a violation of a moral code in a not so subtle, nod towards a particular brand of Christianity. And I think you're right. I think that becomes the background noise, depending on what Reddits and which subreddits and which corners of the internet you're hanging out on.
Yeah, and a big thing about this, like, kind of stirring up, the panic and, like, getting them. It's a market. It's an industry. It's very lucrative. People, very powerful people up top, right, are benefit from having people riled up or mad or stirred up, and background noise, right, to distract, to confuse, to get people thinking about, bring back the green M&M's boot heels back, please. And then you're not talking about other things that might be more important, or things that might pay attention.
At least we're discussing art, I guess. That's kind of like discussing art.
Yeah,
I also wonder how much of this is maybe funneled specifically toward the youth, knowing that, I remember when I was in it that we were told all the time that, like, statistically, that people either convert, like the rate of conversion after 18 falls off, like, really dramatically. And so, like, they were kind of like telling us that in the youth group to say, like, now's the time you got to talk to your friends and save them from eternal hell. But I also wonder how much of the purity culture media is maybe, like, aimed towards youth and going through those channels, like Castor Troy was talking about, where it's more directed specifically now.
You get the cross section of any sort of thing like that, where they have a direct funnel to the youth, like you're calling on Olive. And the same way, like you were talking about when we were kids, though, they still talk to the youth's parents, but they're selling a slightly different version of the message. It's like, hey, this is what you should be afraid of. Here's what we're putting out that your kids are watching. That's definitely the safe stuff, but be afraid of this other stuff. So, and the reason the drop off is after 18, because kids truly start to get more autonomy at that point. It's like, oh, I can make some decisions for myself. So if you funnel all the fear mongering to the parents when they can still, quote unquote, control the children, and funnel directly to the children with a message that's like, hey, save your friends now, because after a certain point, they're lost causes. It's a two-pronged attack that's shown to be very effective. And that's largely what it is.
I am now a lost cause.
Sorry.
Can I give, like, a really quick example? Yeah. The reverse happened to my partner. She was very Christian. She went to a very small evangelical Christian school. She went to, in South Carolina, this place called the Wilds, which is a very famous, very large Christian camp, which they do a lot of, like, activities, but also very focused on, like, the Bible and studies. So she was really in it, and her parents weren't. So she already kind of, like, got a lot of opportunities to express her faith almost on her own, right? Like, the parents weren't really, they were like, we're happy so long as you're Christian, right? Like, we're good so long as you, like, believe. But us going to church and doing all this stuff, not really our thing. But if you do it, that's cool. And then she went on, and then once she got, like, in her 20s, she realized, you know what? This isn't my jam. This isn't me. And then she just dropped it cold turkey. And her parents were like, well, do you believe in God? And I'm like, I guess. And she'll, okay, cool. So like the parents are cool so long as like there's like a belief. But they're fine if they don't practice. So I'm curious if there's like something when teenagers reach a certain age where they realize this activity, this expression of faith isn't fulfilling, isn't me anymore.
Well, I think that that's the age that, a lot of deconstruction tends to happen. But I also wonder if we're going to see more of that because, church affiliation, continues to decline. And I think people are developing a little more casual relationship with their religion, almost, sort of like what you described.
There's also the aspect which is the changing world of media. Overwhelmingly, when you look at media consumption, people who continue to watch TV are older. I think boomers watch something like twice as much TV as millennials. It's wild. And so the idea complex that a lot of older people take place in or take part in rather is so fundamentally different from the set of ideas that younger people are in. And I think there is a moral panic in that people pick up on this difference. The youth clearly, collectively, largely think different when you take statistics and put them together. And they pick up on this, and then they see the idea that, oh, I'm not in control of the values I'm imparting, and that's one of the duties I've been taught that I have to give to kids, right? And so when that disconnect is registered, they have to go on the defensive and try to find ways to take back control from their mindset. And so I think that's largely what this is. When we see media aiming for kids, it's for this purpose. It's to lessen this anxiety, but I think it often misses the mark in that it's created by and for people who simply consume an entirely different set of media. And that's largely why it feels weird to some of us who are younger, who are the target audience of this, because it's so detached from our experienced world and yet so directly trying to reach out to us, right?
Well, and I've heard, I've heard a number of Christians throw around the phrase "be not conformed to the world," which is actually like half of a biblical citation or whatever. And that if your goal is to not be conformed to the world and chart your own course, then, you can't be surprised when you don't go mainstream. And I'm sure there's plenty of Christians out there who would say, no, I'm not mainstream. And, that would sort of be a mark of their success in some way. Well, we are, I think we're running a little late, but we started a little late. So I want to give everyone an opportunity to say their final thought, but I should probably wrap it up relatively soon. I don't want to demand too much of you all's time.
Well, before we do that, then I think Ghost Cat's been raising the hand down there for a bit. You want to call them up to say some quick wordage?
Oh, I invited him up.
Yeah. Well, I guess while we wait on that, there is that kind of we were talking about earlier how like we're consuming different mediums, because I think what would be like the generation's kind of consumption were like online and maybe streaming, and that we're like getting exposed to like very different viewpoints, and it kind of to me makes sense why people are sort of like, I'm gonna back away from affiliating myself from any like Christian group or whatever, because really what's the point, right? I they sort of just kind of shrug and kind of not care too much. Oh, Ghost Guy is here.
Did you want to ask a question or share a thought, Ghost Cat? Well, carry on what you were saying, Void Boy.
Oh, yeah, sure. And I'm wondering. I'm still having in this thought of the made for TV shows, right, might have like a stronger, more conservative Christian group because it's catering to the old generation, while the newer entertainment stuff is kind of like more free. They have more range of tackling different subjects, which someone who's young and trying to figure themselves out get exposed to like so many different things. They tend to leave like the value system that they've been given early on and go somewhere else because they see like totally different, like they see different
and I wonder if
expressions. Sorry.
I wonder if social media influencers are sort of meant to make up that gap. What you were saying is sort of like the difference between those taking stuff in through cable TV and more isolated parts on the internet, perhaps that there's an effort to try to reach each in a different way.
Yeah. There is like a lot of influencers out there. I mean, I've seen them a lot. Trying to kind of reach the younger generation, some with success, some with mostly fighting, but it's probably going to take like a long time for it to see kind of like this more my biggest wish is to kind of have like a more constructive, more tangible, like more practical expression of faith, right? Like an expression that kind of, it doesn't need to be attached to a much larger group. You know what I mean? Because that's what happens.
That they're like a deinstitutionalized sort of faith.
Exactly. And then you try to focus more, instead of being reactionary, which that's some of these influencers tend to be, and I don't like reactionary. I like them when they actually grapple with things in a proactive way, or like there's multiple paths they can take. They can take it from like the meditation side, or from the scriptural side, and actually grapple with these things. Like, what does it mean to have faith? What does it mean to be Christians? And like that sort of thing I find more interesting, but I guess it's not as popular. So to get more eyes on you, you gotta be reactionary. You gotta be out there. And I think Troy left us. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Oh no. It seems like Castor Troy's laptop has turned on him. We're coming up to the end of our time anyway. Ghost Cat, did you want to speak up as we're kind of closing up shop here?
I mean, I don't trust like the Catholic Church at all because I've seen a lot of satanic crap. So.
Very young person. Yay.
Yeah. I think one thing I wanted to say just about purity culture in general is that, I know I've been a little critical here, and I'm sure that there's a lot of folks that have different definition of, what righteous living is, and everyone should be free to pursue that. But I think I get a little more, critical when it seems like someone's not just holding on to a value that is theirs, but pushing that value or expecting that value to be something that everyone should abide by. Maybe that's just me. But that's sort of my final thought. As my cat's yelling at me, so I'm going to let you guys give your final thoughts now.
I resonate with that, and I think that's really the main issue. I think with a lot of different things is like where do your beliefs begin to negatively affect another person, and I feel like in my own life, the effects of purity culture again is something that like I'm still actively working through and still actively trying to figure out like how like where those effects are being felt, because it again, it was just like the water that I swam in for so long, that I held on to my virginity for quite some time after I no longer identified as a Christian. And it was just a very difficult path, I think, to sort of explore, because there's so much shame that gets attached to it. And I think that's really where the danger is that like once it's no longer something where it's like, this is something that you can do that might affect you in a certain way, but rather this is a thing that will fundamentally change you as a human being, and we start to bring shame into the picture, I think then the effects of these things start to go far beyond what we intend for them to. The intention is to keep young people safe. The intention is to hopefully just to keep young people safe. But I think, Broclen, as you mentioned before too, like even for those who did stay with the expectation and kept virginity into marriage, then you get into a marriage and you don't know what you're doing, which to some extent is, to each their own. Again, like for like some people really love that idea of that I'm waiting until I think Void Boy, you were talking about a friend of yours waiting to even kiss until they got married. But I think I have discovered that the body and the human sensory experience is, to me, a one of the lenses and windows with which I now practice my faith and practice connection with spirit, really. And once you dive into that and start like dealing with that directly, all of this programming and things that you ideas that you've picked up along the way, it takes some really careful extraction to even like name what they are and to start to uproot the things that have negative impacts in a way that you were not trying to take on when you were just trying to be a good Christian person. So I guess, if anybody has young people in your life and you're kind of wondering like how to sort of encourage purity in a healthy way, I think as much as possible that you can separate like the acts of things that we do from the value of who you are, especially for female body people and people assigned female at birth. There's so much pressure placed on us to be not just pure ourselves, but also to keep other people pure. So I think as much as we can move away from that is going to do the world a service.
Jacob, Voidboy, you want to share your final thoughts before I read our show notes?
Final thoughts are pressure your local government to not have abstinence only sex education. That is my final thought. You will avoid a lot of these problems if kids understand about sex. So, yeah.
Thanks for bringing it to a practical place. Real problem solver.
Yeah, I can't beat that. I really resonate a lot with what Olive said, especially when it comes to what purity culture kind of breeds fear. It breeds shame. And at the end, you kind of leave a person questioning if they are even worthy of love or even basic human empathy. And that is, not good. Having someone who has experienced like purity culture and like the fear and the shame of not being worthy of love of another person is something that just changes you fundamentally in the very deep level, and it's so hard to even know what's wrong or what's going on, and peeling it off might take decades and years. So there is a lot we can talk about purity culture in terms of like discussing it and how to change it. I think Jacob's kind of hit it in the nail, just kind of just let people know what it's all about, the birds and the bees, and how it's, not this mystical, unknowable act that shrouded in mystery. Like the more you know about it, the less scary it is, and the less, less of a big deal it is, and it helps people. I think you can still treat sex as something that is sacred and something that it should be taken seriously. I think that's fine. But the amount of fear and shame that is injected, especially into young people who are developing their brains still, is for me where I kind of have like reservations with. So I'm sure that more conversations like this happened in other spaces, and more people kind of be aware of it. And hopefully we can find something that's more practical, more reasonable, and ultimately more loving, because I think people seek spirituality because they want to belong, because they want to be loved, because they just want to have to be a part of something that's bigger than them. And I think, to me, that's really what matters.
Well, thank you all very much for joining us for this conversation. I feel like we've been sort of building to it for a while, so I'm glad we could all be here. Thanks again to Castor Troy, who was taken down by a rogue Windows update. We wish him a speedy recovery, and we're sure we'll have him on another show in the future. Before I read our show notes, I just want to remind everyone that our fundraiser for St. Jude is currently ongoing. We have partnered with a bunch of other subreddits to help support St. Jude during Lent. You can find a link to our fundraiser in our comments section below. I think we've covered everything here. Again, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for listening. This has been the Dank Christian Memes podcast. Our Dank Christian Memes is a place for all kinds of Christians and all kinds of non-Christians to enjoy memes and fellowship. If you'd like to connect with our community further, we have social links in our description. Our music is provided by Olive Tiger. Thanks again, Olive. And thank you all for listening. And until next time, may the memes bless you and keep you.